Yep. What's going on, everyone? Welcome to this week's episode of Can I Kick It FC. I am your host, as always, Elliot Barr, and is joining me is one of the guys that is not only in love with Wilfried Nancy, has probably expert knowledge on MLS as a whole, is one of the leading voices for Phoenix Rising FC, he's one of the leading voices for Total Soccer Show, owns his own soccer media company in Backhill, which you should go check out. And am I forgetting anything else?
I mean, that was brilliant and lovely, and the check is in the mail, Elliot, already. Let's go.
It's Mr. Joe Lowery. How are you doing, sir?
I am doing great. I am happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me, and always happy to talk Wilfried Nancy.
I love it, man. I love it. I feel like there is, inside of the American soccer media, whatever you call it is, there's like a small niche section of like soccer historians, and I feel like me and you fit in that lane.
Hey, let's go. We were talking before we started about these kinds of shows, stuff that Toodle's done, Soccer 101 that Taylor and Daryl started a long time ago. This show, there is such a special place in my heart for those kinds of shows that chronicle not just the day-to-day stuff, what happens every weekend. And of course there's a place for that. And that's where I find myself more often than not, to be honest. But there's such a place for looking more in depth at these topics that tell stories and going deeper. And I love that stuff. So I'm so glad to be here.
Yeah, man. Of course, man. Like this is an episode I've been meaning to do for a while, and to have you on to talk about the great Wilfried Nancy, a manager who I will protect to my dying breath. I am all here to have you on for it.
Let's go. Let's do
it. All right. So first of all, let's start off with Wilfried Nancy, like his career path and everything like that. Because if you look at his journey, it's a very, I don't know how to put it, not unassuming one, but one that it kind of starts off very slow and then boosts off. So like one of the questions I got for you is like, you consider like he started playing in France. How does he go from playing in France to becoming one of the best coaches in MLS recent history? Like, how does him playing in France help him transition into management?
Yeah, I think Wilfried Nancy gets involved in the game very early and clearly loves this sport very early on. And these are not all things that I've talked about him. I talked about with him before, though I have had the chance to chat with him a handful of times. It's Wilfried Nancy knowing the game, loving the game, and also realizing that he probably was never going to be an elite soccer player. I think the highest level that Nancy reaches as a player is the second division in France, which is way better than 99.999% of the population, but it's still not a player like Thierry Henry, who he comes across as a youth player in France, and they're both youth players at the time, and eventually they link up together in Montreal. They were on very different career paths, I think, at that point. And I imagine even Wilfried Nancy knew that. And he ends up coming, the story as I understand it, is he ends up coming to New York City to visit some family, ends up in Canada, basically has a backpack on his back, and starts coaching and starts trying to implement how he thinks about and sees the game of soccer into a team, and to have his vision be the thing that is played out on the field by his players at all sorts of different age levels. And being in Canada opened up coaching opportunities for him to then go and work through his career and progress eventually to the Wilfried Nancy that we know today.
Yeah, and so like how much of that connection with Thierry Henry, because Thierry Henry started his coaching career at Montreal, which I remember memorably because I just remember him cussing someone out at MLS Backers tournament. But like, how much of that connection helped Wilfried Nancy get into coaching? Like you said, because they knew each other through youth teams in France.
My understanding is that it maybe was a bit more coincidental than not. I don't think, and I haven't asked Wilfried Nancy about this in particular. I don't think it was that he and Thierry Henry were best buds or anything at the time that they had happened to play against each other at the U17 level or whatever it was. But I think coming alongside Wilfried Nancy again in Montreal and having Nancy be an assistant on Henry's staff, and then Henry leaves right before the 2021 season, and Nancy gets promoted and takes over that job full-time as the manager in that 2021 season. One thing that Wilfried Nancy has talked about before, and he did a good interview with Roger Bennett of Men in Blazers recently, Nancy, he talked about how even though he wasn't this super high-level player, you have to learn how to communicate what you want. You have to learn how to get in the mind of people who were, and players who maybe are better at soccer than you, Wilfried Nancy would have been as a player. And so having that time spent around Thierry Henry as this elite manager for Wilfried Nancy now in the context of Major League Soccer, having the chance to be alongside Henry as a coach certainly helps you learn more about how to tap into the mind of the elite player. So I think all these things tie together. It's a fun little anecdote along the way for him.
Yeah, and speaking about tapping into the mind of like Wilfried Nancy, like what makes him distinct as a manager? Like how would you describe his tactics? Because for the longest I've heard, he's great. He's a great possession manager. He's great at taking like unsecured talent. I heard a story about like he took like a futsal player. He made him like one of the best defenders at MLS. Like how does Wilfried Nancy go about building his tactics?
Yeah, I think that's Mo Farsi, who was up in Canada playing indoor soccer, futsal, something along those lines, and is a starting player for Columbus as they win MLS Cup. It's a great story, and there are so many of those stories for the Columbus Crew of players in new positions and new tactical approaches, and players joining the team and sort of being, just kind of in awe in the first few training sessions of what they're doing that is just on a different level than so many other coaches in Major League Soccer. Wilfried Nancy tactically, I think you said it there, Elliot, really well. He is a possession-oriented coach. He is somebody who wants to control the game with the ball. And that doesn't just mean passing for the sake of passing, but it is using possession to do two things. The first is to score goals. And the second is to keep the ball so that your opponent can't score goals, right? Yeah. That whenever you have the ball, those are the two things that are happening on the soccer field, is that you're trying to score goals and you're preventing naturally the opposition from doing the same thing. The thing that has made Nancy unique is not the fact that he said he's a possession coach. At press conferences, the kind of joke is when a new coach is hired, everybody says the same thing, right? Everybody says, I want to play fast, aggressive, proactive, possession-oriented soccer that's fun to watch. Like you could just kind of check those boxes off as you're listening to a presser from a new coach in a new spot in any league in the world. Those are super normal things. The difference for Wilfried Nancy is that he's actually done it. And even more different for him than most coaches in MLS is he's done it in not one place, but two places in Major League Soccer. He was worth paying a transfer fee in the mind of the Columbus Crew and former president Tim Bezbatchenko. They bring him in from Montreal, and he has a very, very similar impact in Columbus to what he did in Montreal. So the repeatability of what he's done, clearly he is a better communicator of his ideas to his players than, maybe anybody that we've seen in MLS.
So I think that's such an interesting point because, like you said, like we've heard so many coaches talk about like, oh, I want to do this, I want to do this and do this. And then when you see them, it's like, dude, you are playing like old school half-court basketball. Like this is not it. How much of him being an effective communicator and his adaptability, because you talk about like he went from CF Montreal to the Columbus Crew, like how important for him, along with MLS roster rules, how important is it for him to be an effective communicator?
It's such an asset. And I love that you brought up MLS roster rules where, in Major League Soccer, it's not like Pep Guardiola coaching Man City, where I think the anecdote was Columbus had a friendly this past summer against Aston Villa, and Pep was there for whatever reason. And he comes up to Nancy afterwards and is kind of joking, how did you beat Villa? Like we struggle with this at City, and they have kind of the conversation and Pep's making jokes about, how Nancy needs to teach them the way. And maybe there's even some truth to that, because these guys are like constant learners. They're always trying to absorb information. And for Nancy, in MLS, you don't have Man City level resources. You don't have that. And so being able to help players become something more, players coming out of college or distressed assets within MLS, or players coming from different backgrounds in Canada, where now he has a different background in Canada. It's such a huge help. It was a huge help for Montreal. It's a huge help now with Columbus. It will be a huge help for wherever he goes next if he doesn't stick in Columbus long term. Those things are massive. And I think the thing that really does, and maybe I've said this already, but the thing that really in my mind sets Wilfried Nancy apart is how he seems to communicate his ideas to his players, right? One of the first jobs that Wilfried Nancy has, one of his first coaching gigs, is coaching a girls U14 team, right? So a very, very different level than coaching, high level men's professional players. It is very different as a context. And he embraced it as a challenge of, okay, how do I communicate to these players? And how do I do this differently for, girls U14s versus boys U17s or versus the Columbus Crew now? And having that mindset of, I have to be adaptable to what's around me. I have to be adaptable because my players are going to be different in one place to the next place on one team versus the next team. My ideas might not change, but how I think about communicating those ideas probably should be different. It's not my players that have to always adapt to me, though there is certainly some of that, but it's how can I try to get in the mind and help these players understand wherever they are, whoever they are. And it really does seem to me that Nancy has done that at such a high level.
Yeah. For you, like, when was the moment that it clicked to you? It was like, oh, he's a different level of coach at MLS. because you've had so many of those moments where like the audience or the fans will anoint a coach and be like, oh, he's the next guy. For you, when was that moment that you knew that Wilfried Nancy was a different level of coach?
Yeah, it's 2022. So his first season in 2021, Henry leaves, I think, in February or March of that year. And then Nancy has the season, and Montreal just end up missing the playoffs, if memory serves. They end up, I think, in 9th in the Eastern Conference, or right around there. They have a good season, though, and there are building blocks. Their underlying numbers looked good, but you didn't know for sure, right? It's such a small sample size. You get into 2022, you fast forward to the end of that season, and CF Montreal finished 2nd in the Eastern Conference. This is a CF Montreal team that does not spend money on their first team roster, right? They don't really spend a lot of money on transfer fees. Fast forwarding a little bit further to this season, Victor Wanyama, great player, not really a great player anymore. He's their only designated player, and he doesn't really play at all under Laurent Courtois up in Montreal. Montreal's ownership, the Saputo family, doesn't really spend money on the squad. And that Wilfried Nancy got that team to finish 2nd in the Eastern Conference with spenders like Atlanta United around them, with FC Cincinnati trying to find themselves, with the New York, with teams with just straight up more resources, was so impressive to me that you saw Georgi Mihailovic and Alistair Johnston and Ismail Kone, all those guys get sold to Europe off the back of that 2022 CF Montreal team. Nancy literally made his team money. He made his players money by elevating their profiles, and he had success on the field. They made the playoffs. They were a really, really good team that season. That, for me, was the moment where I realized that season really was the series of moments where I realized this guy's doing something different. Like, he's having success in a place that is not impossible, clearly, but really, really hard to have success in. Like, he is a guy worth watching.
Wow. And you mentioned it there with CF Montreal. Like, granted, like, he started under Thierry Henry, and let me ask you this: like, how much, or if all, did Thierry Henry have any influence on Wilfried Nancy, or was it always that moment of? Because sometimes you see this with coaches, where it's like the head coach is a figure, but then the assistant coach is like the real guy coaching the team. Was it like that in Montreal when Thierry Henry was their coach?
Well, so I think the timeline here is interesting because Nancy was in Montreal before Henry, right? And so Wilfried Nancy is on that staff and in the CF Montreal organization before Henry gets there. So I think there are certainly some areas in which Henry would have impacted Nancy. Although I'll be honest, I don't think there's a lot of tactical overlap between those two coaches. Under Henry, we saw Montreal use a back three shape in possession, which has been the go-to look for Nancy. There are similarities, don't get me wrong, but sort of how I think about Nancy, and I haven't asked him this, so maybe I'm speaking out of turn here, but I do think there's a sense in which Nancy already had his tactical convictions and just needed a place to paint them on a canvas, right? And I think that's what ends up happening in Montreal once Henry leaves. But I do think there are real ways in which Henry would have impacted Wilfried Nancy. How would it not have happened that way, right? I think about that viral clip. I know exactly the clip you mentioned earlier with Henry, where he is just fuming on the sidelines as his players can't do what he thinks are simple things on the field. Because for Thierry Henry, they are simple things. And for Romain Kyoto, Saint-Piet, maybe they're not so simple. And I think Wilfried Nancy gets to observe those things and gets to see it maybe a little bit into the mind of an elite player and how he can try to coach those guys. Now he's coaching Cucho Hernandez in Columbus, one of the most talented attacking players that MLS has ever seen. I would imagine that Wilfried Nancy knows better how to relate to Cucho Hernandez from having spent time around Thierry Henry, that he knows better how to relate to Diego Rossi and some of the other stars he's worked with from Henry. So I would have to imagine there'd be overlap there. How could there not, you know?
Yeah, no, for sure. And I imagine so as well. And speaking about that, in MLS history, like, there hasn't been a plethora, we'll say, of coaches, of black coaches. I mean, Thierry Henry, Robin Fraser, Wilfried Nancy. If I'm forgetting one,
Ezra Hendrickson comes to mind for me in Chicago, and probably a couple of more along the way. But your point absolutely stands.
Yeah. So, like, it's been tough for coaches of college to get that break. And we're seeing more and more and more. Definitely there in Phoenix, you know. You guys just hired one down there. Historically, like, how do you think this impacted his journey? Like, being a coach of color coming through.
I think in a lot of ways it made it harder. And Wilfried Nancy has talked about this before. I think it was February, sometime earlier this year, he wrote a piece after Columbus had won MLS Cup, sort of talking about his life and his upbringing, and talked about encountering racism. And it didn't, give a lot of specific examples of that in the story, but is a guy who has lived that life. And I think about that story he wrote, and there's this quote. Here it is. I found the quote. Quote, I grew up with racism, simple as that. I had to do double or triple the work to show that I had the quality to do what normal people wanted me to do. That, I think, sums up Wilfried Nancy, and I would have to imagine the life of so many coaches of color trying to find themselves in this space. Nancy talked about, I had to do more, straight up. I had to do more. I think in so many ways it makes it more difficult when you're trying to rise up in Major League Soccer, which is changing and it is evolving, and there are more coaches and people in all different sorts of roles of different backgrounds being given more opportunities and working into those roles now. Of course there are, but still in so many ways, MLS and American soccer, and I think this holds true around the world, is an old boys club, right? It is so many of the people that have held those positions of power for such a long time. And this is not just a soccer problem or a soccer trait. This is a world trait. This is a things are not as they should be kind of traits, but it is absolutely true in American soccer. And so it is just harder, I think, for folks like Wilfried Nancy to get those kinds of opportunities.
Yeah. And what do you think it means to have like a manager such as Wilfried Nancy, a black man of foreign descent, being in such a prominent leadership position at MLS and like globally? Like, how? I mean, you're in MLS circles more than I am. Like, how does MLS feels about that, and how do they like promote it?
I think MLS absolutely wants to see people with more diverse backgrounds in these roles, because even from just a practical standpoint, having the chance to look up and see somebody who's like you in a role, I think broadens the talent pool, right? It broadens the list of people who might care enough or stick with difficulty long enough to come be a part of your thing, right? If you're Major League Soccer, like you want all the Wilfried Nancy's in your league. You want all of the, Hendricksons in your league. You want all the Pamudakars in your league. And like, that just seems like a no-brainer to me. And I mean, I suppose I don't really know how MLS feels about it, but I don't know how you couldn't feel that way. You want as many qualified, brilliant people in your thing, soccer, business, whatever, as possible. And I think getting to see Wilfried Nancy do what he's done is something that can help start and kickstart those sorts of cycles. Nancy, in that same article I referenced earlier, talked about how he comes to North America when I think he's a teenager at some point, visiting some family. And one of the things that he sees is black people in ads on TV. And he talks about in France, you just wouldn't see that. Like he'd never seen that in France before. And that's maybe a bit of a slightly different example of then, seeing another coach on the sidelines who shares a lot of experiences with you, but there are similarities there. And so I think the more of those moments that more and more people can have, the better off we're all probably going to be.
Yeah. No, I was speaking like from my experience, like growing up and someone who got into soccer maybe later, but it was interesting to me to see like coaches of color, like, Clarence Seedorf and Chris Sanders and all those others, and be like, oh, snap, like, we're there. And to see like Wilfried Nancy and Robert Fraser, and to see how they have progressed and see how they have grown over time, like it definitely resonates with you differently. Because you're used to seeing like players, black players and things like that, but to see your coach or to see someone that like leads and run the club, it just gives you a totally different feeling.
Yeah, totally. And I think there's so many ways to think about that, right? This is a very different example, and I want to be clear. But I do think there's something interesting to kind of share some experience for me. Like I get into soccer, and a lot of the stuff that interests me is analysis and like trying to figure out the X's and O's of what happens. And I didn't play soccer at a high level. And the very first game I cover in person, I have some older journalists come over and tell me like, yeah, you shouldn't be doing this because you didn't play soccer, right? You shouldn't be talking about strategy and the X's and O's because you didn't play. Like your work doesn't mean anything because of that. And it didn't really bother me because that seemed a bit silly to me at the time. And having more and more of these coaches who didn't play at the highest levels, and Nancy is one example of that, although he played still at a pretty high level, but to have more of these younger coaches come in and break in and show that they do know the sport and that they can be a successful manager or a successful whatever. It's just cool to see that kind of stuff. Whatever your background is, whatever that specific thing is, it's amazing to see those kinds of people make their way to the top. And I think Nancy is the perfect guy to look to in so many of these different ways.
Yeah. Yeah, no, honestly, man. And it's also great to see because like of what is being built in Columbus. Like we're talking about a club that was like on the brink of being Austin before Austin got there, and being one of the historical clubs at MLS, and seeing that success, like how big was that moment of him winning MLS Cup. Like just that moment is like, how big was that to see?
It felt big, man. I was there at Lower.com Field about a year ago now, and it just felt like the storybook for Columbus in so many ways. You talk about Save the Crew and them almost going to Austin when Anthony Precourt tries to move them down there, and there's enough rallying locally and eventually investment that gets them to stay, and Austin gets their own team anyway. And Columbus felt like something had been taken from them, like, or at least that somebody had tried to take stuff from them, which is absolutely true. And it was a really, really special thing to be able to be there to witness Columbus make history in that way. And it's not their first trophy. They'd won MLS Cup back in 2020. That was a weird year though with COVID. Fans were actually in the stands. It was loud. Everybody was so excited about what they'd accomplished. And even to think about Nancy in this story, for it to be his first year in Columbus and for it to be like a real validation of what the Columbus Crew had gone out and done, which is to pay CF Montreal for his services. You don't see a lot of coaches that are kind of in that player transfer market sort of situation where one team pays another team to break their contract so that they can then sign them to a contract. That's what transfer fees are in soccer.
Yeah.
And that's what happened with Wilfried Nancy. You just don't see that in Major League Soccer. Columbus believed in him enough to go out there and want to do that. And that was like, I don't know, man, one of the best decisions they've ever made. It was a cool moment to see Nancy get his flowers and still to be getting those flowers now and to see Columbus as a city get to enjoy that trophy.
Yeah. No, I imagine that had to be an epic moment being there. And speaking about him, let's kind of fast forward to this season. He wins MLS Cup, wins Leagues Cup as well this year. I mean, not MLS Cup. He wins MLS Coach of the Year.
Yeah.
Wins Leagues Cup, takes his team to the brink of the Campeones Cup. I think they also made it to the championship, the CONCACAF final.
CONCACAF Champions Cup final. Yep, you're exactly right.
Okay. I was trying to make room because it's
you nailed it.
Like, what we already talked about how he stands out above MLS coaches, but like as a manager, what made this season so special for him that he got honored to be MLS Coach of the Year? Because, like you said, like a couple of years ago, he just won MLS Cup, and he didn't get it. He didn't get it in the year that he took Montreal, a relative small club at MLS, to second place. So, what made this year the year where it was like, no, we're going to recognize you MLS Coach of the Year?
I think I'm probably voted Nancy all the last 3 years, 2022 in Montreal, where I think Jim Curtin ends up winning that. I'm consistent, man. I'm consistent. And that's because Wilfried Nancy in so many ways has been the same coach, right? It's not like he's drastically changed his tactical philosophy in each of the last 3 years. I steadfastly believe he's gotten more than the sum of the parts of his players out there on the field. And Jim Curtin wins it in 2022 with the Union, and they had a great season too. And Jim Curtin had done it in so many ways a really good job there. Pat Noonan wins it since he won the Shield last year. And I think, did quite well. But I just don't see another coach in Major League Soccer that transforms players in the way that Wilfried Nancy does. And I think maybe there's a sense in which all the other voters this year, maybe not all of them, that's probably a bit unfair, but all of the folks in the media that vote for these things and players, I believe players vote for Coach of the Year too. I know they vote for some of the other awards. Like all of the stakeholders in this award kind of realize, hey, we don't know if Wilfried Nancy is going to be here for too much longer. We got to get him one before he leaves, right? And I actually don't like that reasoning at all, because it feels like you're then maybe ruining somebody else along the way. But this year it was going to be Tata Martino, or it was going to be Wilfried Nancy. And Tata Martino's Miami team win the Supporter Shield. They set the single season points record, and the voting had stopped before they got bounced by United in the playoffs.
For Tata to win,
it would have been, and now he's gone as well, right? Like it would have been strange. But Wilfried Nancy wins it, and the reason why I voted for Wilfried Nancy is because I don't think Tata Martino, between the two of them, did a ton to elevate the team. Like you look at Miami, and Tata's job was much more rotation, like managing minutes, managing the bench, those kinds of things, and managing egos, than it was tactical stuff. And I think Nancy's done a bit of both. And the Miami job is really hard because it is a weird situation. It's one of one in the world. Really, it's certainly one of one in Major League Soccer. But Nancy got so much across so many competitions with this group of players, guys that he's helped elevate. I just don't think there is a better coach in Major League Soccer, and I'm not really sure when we're going to see another one as good as he is.
I mean, talking about how good he is as a coach, like when he got hired to Columbus, we talked about it a little bit already about his technical flexibility and how he's possession-oriented coach. But like, in your mind, what were like the three biggest changes he did to Columbus to transform into this quote unquote juggernaut that they are now in MLS?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think three of these changes, one of them that I would certainly think of, and I guess you could break this out a little bit into multiple, but is just when he gets to Columbus, the changes that he makes to where players are playing. And that sounds kind of basic because you would think one coach comes in and they're probably going to have a different vision than the coach before them and they'll tweak little things. I don't just mean little things. I mean, Steven Moreira was Defender of the Year this year for the Columbus Crew under Caleb Porter before Wilfried Nancy gets here. So Porter's coaching before Nancy arrives. And under Caleb Porter, Steven Moreira is like a bang on average right back in Major League Soccer. And fast forward 2 seasons, and he's the Defender of the Year, playing as a right-sided center back in a different position. I think about Monte Amundsen, who comes in after Nancy arrives from NYCFC. He played as a left back for NYCFC, had a lot of success there, moves inside to play as a left-sided center back, and all of a sudden looks like an even better player and plays one of the craziest passes I've ever seen in MLS Cup last year against LAFC for a just delightful build-up sequence that the Crew score a goal off of. I think about Yaya Boa, who was a bad left winger under Caleb Porter and becomes the starting left wing back for the Columbus Crew in MLS Cup and scores a goal. Mo Farsi, another guy who was sort of unlocked, just player after player after player that Nancy moves into a different spot. So I don't know, maybe there's one or two things there. The other thing that really comes to mind for me is Wilfried Nancy changing the stars in his team. It's Cucho Hernandez who's already there when Wilfried Nancy arrives, and it's Lucas Zelarayan, who was like kind of the flashy number 10 who'd been in Columbus longer than Cucho. Cucho comes in to join Zelarayan, and it's those guys starting through the middle for Caleb Porter. Well, in the summer transfer window last year, Nancy's first season with this club, Lucas Zelarayan's gone. He moves over to the Middle East, and it makes Columbus a nice chunk of change, and maybe that move would have happened regardless. And I don't know if that was, sparked at all by Nancy or not. But Zelarayan leaves, and Columbus almost immediately have their next target. They have Diego Rossi, who is very much not a number 10, much more of a forward and a vertical threat compared to Zelarayan, who is I'm going to drop and get on the ball and do kind of classic number 10 kind of stuff. And Nancy's team didn't seem to miss a beat. They got better by making that change. And I kind of have to believe that is, at least in part, coming from the coaching staff and coming from Nancy of, hey, this is how we want to play. We don't want ball stoppers. We don't want somebody who's going to slow the rhythm of our possession like Zelarayan. Even though he's a good player, we want people who are going to help keep the rhythm because that's so much of what makes us special in possession as a team. And that change, I think, is just another microcosm of how the Columbus Crew have become so synonymous with Wilfried Nancy's way of playing.
Yeah, and oh man, I'm just thinking about like just moments where I've watched this team play because I also watched Charlotte FC and whatnot, and like I remember telling my wife like, "You're watching like art happen,"
Hey,
and it's just it's something about watching another team and you're seeing like, regardless of who's on the field, you can tell exactly what he's doing within the first 5 minutes.
Yeah,
and that's something I've seen so many times with Wilfried. I was like, I relate a lot of coaching to like teaching, right? And I think the way how Wilfried Nancy like teaches his players, you can tell. Like if Wilfried Nancy just sat on the bench and be like, "All right, y'all go do it," they will be perfectly fine. Like that's how I think how great of a coach he is.
Yeah, 100% agree. And I don't know, man. I know a lot of people, and I come on TSS and I talk about it, and the guys poke fun at me because how much I love Wilfried Nancy. Like I've just never seen this stuff before. Like I've just never seen the Columbus Crew's roster is good. Cucho Hernandez is a very good player who would be a very good player under any manager. I think I feel pretty confident about that. Diego Rossi is a good player. We've seen him have success in MLS before under Bob Bradley. Like Darlington Nagbe is a great MLS player and will go down as one of the all-time legends of this league. Outside of those guys, like this is just not a very talented roster, at least as far as I can tell. I think about Rudy Camacho, who Nancy brings over from Montreal when, a little bit after he's arrived. Rudy Camacho is like an okay MLS center back. Moreira, I think if another coach comes in and he goes back to right back, is just, again, not going to look very good. Like you just run through the list of players and it's not like Nancy has an LAFC level talent. It's not like he has anything approaching an Inter Miami level of talent. Like in a lot of respects, this is maybe like the 10th or 12th best roster in Major League Soccer. And Nancy has this team playing like one of the top 4 teams in MLS and did last year towards the end of the season, did all the way through this season, despite playing in a bunch of different competitions. Like I just haven't seen somebody outperform what should be reasonably expected of them in one place like Nancy And I've never seen a coach in MLS do it in 2.
So, and I mean, outside of tactics, like we talked about it as well, like culture building. Like,
Yeah,
you talk about a guy that went into CF Montreal and got a team that was all around, like, it's fair to say, a 6th to maybe 9th place team.
sure.
Got him the second, goes to Columbus, takes a team that is kind of rebuilding their identity and getting back in the community. On top of that, coming back from COVID, dealing with star players, like how much goes into like him just being able to be relatable and motivate his players? Because I mean, you've talked about this before on TSS, where it's like probably the greatest asset a coach has outside of being able to communicate his ideas. Can he resonate with his players? Like, can his players look at him and be like, okay, I believe in what he's saying no matter what?
Yeah, I think they can. And I think part of that is because Wilfried Nancy seems like, in all the times that I've talked with him, he seems like a guy that is easy to have a conversation with in so many ways. He is super introspective and has interesting things to say and is an engaging guy. And I think that helps, right? It's not like you're talking to a brick wall. It's also that he has enough evidence to get player buy-in now. I think about specifically in Columbus, if I'm a Columbus Crew player, and I've been playing under Caleb Porter, and yeah, we won MLS Cup a couple years earlier, or a season earlier, I suppose. And I don't know, the next year was a little bit stale and we couldn't quite figure it out. I look at what CF Montreal did with nothing what Nancy did with CF Montreal. He didn't have nothing to work with there. He had some good players, but I look at what he did there, and I'm stoked that this guy's here. Or if I don't know, DeJuan Jones, who gets traded from the New England Revolution to Columbus this past summer transfer window. I'm not thrilled to have to leave New England because that's where my life is, and getting traded probably sucks. But if I got to go somewhere, I'm pretty darn happy that I'm going to go play for Wilfried Nancy and learn some things about soccer, because I think everybody who plays under Nancy seems to learn something. Everybody, you listen to DeJuan Jones talk, and he was on Soccer Wise with David Goss and Tom Bogert recently, and was talking about how he was just kind of in awe the first few training sessions in Columbus because everybody else was operating at such a high speed and already had a basic to more than basic understanding of what Nancy wanted to do. And DeJuan Jones is like trying to figure it out. It's like he got thrown into Spanish 202 and it only taken Spanish 101, right? So I think it's how he relates to players and how we can talk to them, but also he's kind of reached the point, at least in MLS, and this will change when or if he decides to go take on a new challenge. In MLS, I think his body of work is starting to speak for itself, which is pretty powerful too.
Yeah. One of the things about MLS, Russell, which that is a whole different episode, a whole other day, that I don't think I got the brain capacity at almost 6 o'clock Eastern time to deal with. But I think one of the most underrated things about Wilfried Nancy is how he's able to take young talent from Columbus Crew 2, which is a nice building up MLS Next program, how he's able to take that young player and seamlessly put them through. So, like, how is he as a coach able to nestle in and develop this young talent through Columbus Crew?
Yeah, it's a huge arrow in his quiver, Wilfried Nancy. And I don't know that I have a great answer. It would be a fascinating question to ask him. Other than it seems like he is good at communicating stuff to his players. Like whoever that player is, he can maybe this is in part because of time spent with Henry and other great players over the years. He can seemingly understand and relate to the star. And he can, because maybe this is more of the player he was, relate to the squad player, the role player, somebody who doesn't have a future at the highest levels. So when Max Arfson gets drafted by the Crew and comes into that team and eventually works his way into being the starter on the left wing for Columbus this year, like he can understand how Max Arfson thinks, or at least a little bit more about how Max Arfson thinks than Thierry Henry might be able to do as a coach who didn't experience being drafted by an MLS team, right? So I think he has amassed a really good mix of skill sets and backgrounds and people that he's worked with that makes it maybe just a little bit easier for him to understand how to motivate different kinds of players.
Yeah. Yeah, no, honestly. I mean, we saw it with, like, he took a player like Aiden Morris and got him from Columbus all the way to Middlesbrough, where now, like, everyone is raving about him and everything like that. And, I mean, you've already talked about it. So, I mean, I guess this is a good kind of point to kind of get us to his future.
Sure.
What is there left for Wilfried Nancy to do? Do you think he's the kind of coach where he's a completionist, where he's like, no, I want to win CONCACAF Champions League. I want to win the first, I guess, treble or quadruple in MLS history, or is he like a coach where, all right, my thumbprint is here, and it is time for me to go seek that next shot, whether it is in England or in France or in Germany, wherever. Where does that go for him?
Yeah, I think we will see Wilfried Nancy move on his timeline. I guess, and part of that's because he's earned that right in Columbus. Like, nobody in the Columbus crew front office is going to say like, "Nah, dude, we're not gonna help facilitate this next step for you. We're not going to go help you do that." They're going to be supportive of whatever Wilfried Nancy decides to do, and that could look like a move this offseason or a move, kind of whenever the right opportunity for Wilfried Nancy arrives, because he's earned that in Columbus by bringing trophies to Columbus and changing how people think about the Columbus crew. So he has earned all of that. I don't view Nancy as this completionist. That's a really interesting way to think about it. I think he probably understands that there's a practical limitation to winning everything and how hard that is as a coach in MLS. I mean, he's the guy who also says impossible is an opinion. So what do I know, right? But it does sort of seem to me like Nancy is going to move when he wants to. And that could be after another season and another crack at Champions League and in MLS Cup and trophies and all that stuff after this year kind of ends on a sour note, despite having objectively a good season by basically everybody's standards. It could also look like him being really tempted by the right opportunity in Europe. He seems like a smart enough guy to know to be careful, I guess, when it comes to his job in Europe, because there aren't a lot of MLS coaches that get looks. And a lot of those guys haven't done particularly well over in Europe. And there are so many factors that go into a team succeeding or failing, right? If you give Wilfried Nancy the San Jose Earthquakes roster from this year, the wooden spoon winning roster, like they're not going to finish top 4 in the Western Conference. Probably, I think they'll be better than they were this year. But there are limits on these things. So if you go to a league where there's way more, where the divide between top and bottom is so much bigger, and you give Nancy the worst squad in that league, he still might get relegated, right? There are levels to all this, and it is hard to have an impact on soccer games as a coach. Nancy has just gotten more of those button presses right than most. So I think he'll wait till the opportunity is right for him. When that is, part of me thinks it's going to be this winter. Part of me thinks it might be next year. I mean, it's probably still on the table that he ends up loving Columbus and wants to stay there forever. I think that's by far the least likely outcome. But I think when the time is right for him, and probably not after like the greatest season we've ever seen in MLS, I think he will find a new home, and he's going to be pretty choosy about what that home is.
Yeah. And I'll get you this question. We'll probably wrap up after this, but I'm pretty sure I'm the only one who thinks about it this way, but I like to think of MLS like an era. Like whenever MLS 1.0, 2.0,
sure.
Like if you think about it in terms of eras, like you had the Bruce Arena era, early 90s DC, then you had Bob Bradley, and maybe another Bruce Arena era. Do you feel like now we're living in the Wilfried Nancy era where he is unequivocally like the best coach in MLS? Like this is his era, and then when he'll leave, we'll find another era. Like, do you think that's it?
I think he is, without a doubt, the defining coach of the last 3 seasons in Major League Soccer. Yeah, there's no doubt about it. If you want to think about it in terms of the coaches who have sort of been the face of the league in that time period, it is for me absolutely Wilfried Nancy. It is maybe a bit of a challenge for him in that he hasn't coached in Miami or LA or in New York City, although the New York clubs don't get that much pub from MLS. But being in Montreal, which is about as close as you get to an irrelevant market in Major League Soccer, not in Montreal, but sort of nationally and I guess internationally between the US and Canada. And then Columbus, which is a mid-sized market, although it's great for soccer. I think that probably hurts him a little bit in that Bruce Arena coached some big teams, and Bob Bradley eventually ends up coaching LAFC and coached some big teams before that in big cities. Not to disparage the crew of Montreal, but it's different. Still, I think with the amount of success he's had in multiple places, which again still kind of blows my mind. It's so hard to do. He is without a doubt the defining coaching figure of the last few years. It's also weird too, Elliot, because he overlaps with Messi, and there's a sense in which like maybe Nancy gets buried, but he shouldn't. He absolutely shouldn't, and I don't think he will be by those that have watched or have paid attention even a little bit, or hopefully by everybody listening to this show.
Yeah, for real. We hope not. Well, man, Joe, I just want to say thank you. First of all, so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule, because I know you probably got another article to write for Backhill or watch more MLS. That's the reason why we did that.
This is way more fun than those things. I promise you, this is way more fun.
There's a reason why we didn't do this show on Sunday, because I was like, I know this man is like in a dark hall watching MLS.
Yeah, there's a lot of truth to that. No, this was great. Seriously, Elliot, thank you for having me on. I really love what you're doing. Enjoyed this a ton, and always happy to chat about various MLS topics anytime.
Awesome, man. Well, as always, listeners, we just want to say thank you for taking the time out of your day for listening to our show. From Mr. Joe Lowery and myself, you can catch us. You can catch Can I Kick It FC. We're now on Blue Sky, the new social media platform. We're not on X like that anymore. So you can catch us over there. And with that being said, be easy, be safe, and we'll catch you guys next time to tell you guys an exciting story about Black soccer history.